Stephen Berlin Johnson, somebody who has been thinking a lot about the developing digital environment since, boy, at least since 1997, and I think actually well before that. In between then and now, he's written 7 books on technology, future, and our experiences with both of those things. And he actually has on Twitter 1,454,417 followers. So statistically, there are at least several in the room right now, and many more on the live feed. He has started several web enterprises, including the influential Feed magazine, the Webby Award-winning community site Plastic.com, and the hyperlocal media site Outside.in, recently acquired by AOL. His most recent venture is Findings.com, which is an opportunity to take from various places your Kindle annotations, your surfing online, things that you look at and say are really cool, and be able to share them with others. And I was actually just looking at his Twitter feed, and here's what somebody said about Findings. So Arctic Tony, if you're out there, what you said was, if Twitter is mental popcorn, Findings is mental sushi. Small chunks of raw intellect and a real delight. Hashtag, I will get in trouble for this analogy. So let's enjoy a little mental sushi from Stephen Johnson, and it's best consumed immediately.
Thanks, Robert. Let me just say it's an honor to both follow Vint, but also to be introduced by Jonathan, who is one of the brightest minds on the past and the future of the internet. So you should all look into his work as well. So we're here today really as a celebration of the power of collaboration that is being kind of unleashed by the cloud and these new technologies. And the book that I've written just recently, Where Good Ideas Come From, is really also a celebration of collaboration. It's a kind of a portrait of environments that have led to unusually innovative thinking. And part of the premise of that book is that not all forms of collaboration are equal. There are certain kinds of environments, certain kinds of networks, certain kinds of partnerships that lead to great, amazing new ideas, and then there are certain kinds that kind of squelch ideas and don't lead to innovative thinking. And so what I wanted to do in our time this morning is spend a little bit of our time looking at these kind of patterns and strategies to think not just about collaboration in the abstract, but to really look and focus on what makes a successful collaboration given these amazing new technologies that we have. And I want to do that by looking both at the kind of the past and the future of collaboration. Tell some kind of low-tech stories that I think have high-tech implications, and look at some new high-tech stories from the very recent past. And I thought I would start actually with a story that I wrote a whole book about, which is a story about a 19th century cholera outbreak in London, because it's a great example of an idea that changed the world and a collaboration that changed the world, and also nothing really sets the stage after a morning coffee break than a story about massive intestinal disease. I think that's a good way to kind of start the morning. So this is a story that I had heard before I wrote the book from kind of many angles. And I'll tell you how I heard the story before I wrote the book. This is how it was kind of passed down to me. It's the middle of the 19th century. It's 1854 in London. And London, like all the great cities of Europe during this period, is being kind of besieged by these terrible outbreaks of cholera, one of the great killers of that period. And all the authorities are convinced that cholera is literally in the air, that people are being poisoned by kind of contaminated air. This was the miasma theory of the day, which turned out to be one of the great medical public health mistakes of the period, because as we now know, cholera is caused by contaminated water supplies. You get it by drinking contaminated water that's been kind of infected with this bacteria. So all the authorities are trying to solve this kind of terrifying, deadly problem with the wrong interpretive system. Basically, they're looking to kind of purify the air, and in fact, the problem is in the water. So in the late summer months of 1854, in the neighborhood of Soho in London, at that point one of the poorest and also one of the most densely populated neighborhoods in the entire city, an outbreak of cholera erupts, which turns out to be the most kind of concentrated and devastating outbreak in the history of the city. Within 10 days, 10% of the neighborhood is dead. It's just this kind of horrifying scene. In the middle of this, a local doctor by the name of John Snow, this is the John Snow pub that you can visit during your next cholera tour of London. It's in the middle of Soho. He kind of bravely goes into the middle of this outbreak and starts knocking on doors, trying to figure out who has gotten sick, who has died, and investigates the outbreak kind of in real time as it's unfolding around him, an amazing act of courage. And out of the data that he collects from interviewing people, he builds a map, one of the most important maps in the history of public health, indeed in the history of cartography. And it's a map that shows the location of all the deaths in the neighborhood of Soho, with little black bars corresponding to each death. So at the center of the neighborhood, you see this kind of street of Broad Street that's kind of just covered with death. There's 20 people dying in one place, 10 people dying in another, 5 here, 5 here. And if you look at the map, you can see that as it gets further and further from Broad Street, there is less and less death. And in fact, the map is much bigger than this, than what you see here. And by the edges of it, there's no death at all. And he looks at this map and he sees that there is a pump, a public kind of watering hole where you could get drinking water, right at the center of Broad Street, right at the epicenter of this outbreak. And he looks at this map and he has a eureka moment. He says, aha, cholera is in the water. It's not in the air. Everybody has it wrong. The miasma theory is wrong. We've got to deal with the water, and then we can solve this problem. And so he takes this map and he goes to the authorities and he convinces them of the waterborne theory of cholera. They remove the pump handle. The outbreak stops. Major engineering projects like the London sewers start to be built to deal with the problem of purifying the water. And by 1866, just 12 years later, cholera is gone from London for good, never to return again. So I hear this story and I think, this will be a great book. This is like a Victorian episode of CSI, right? There's a kind of a thriller kind of component to it. And so I start to research this book. And after about 4 or 5 months, what I discover is that almost all the important facts that I just told you are not true. First thing I learned is that John Snow did not have a eureka moment looking at this map. He had, in fact, been working on his waterborne theory of cholera for 6 or 7 years before the outbreak came to his neighborhood. He'd had this hunch that everyone was wrong about this terrible killer and that there might be another kind of solution to the problem. And he'd been investigating, he'd been writing about it, he'd built other maps, in fact. But he couldn't get anyone to kind of listen to his radical idea over that period. And ultimately, when he made the map, it wasn't actually the kind of triggering of an epiphany or a eureka moment. It was almost a marketing vehicle for his idea, because people could look at the map and say, all right, I see what you mean here. And the other thing I found is that he was greatly aided by the release of new public information platforms. The city, a few years before, had started to publish mortality reports that gave much more detail about who had died, where they died, what they had died of, how old they were, what their gender was. This was a very new thing. It had just happened. And he used a lot of that data, actually, in addition to his kind of door-to-door detective work, to build the data in the map and other parts of his argument for the waterborne theory. So it was, in a sense, there was information in the cloud. They were printing it. But the idea was that other people not connected to the government could come and use this data and push it in new directions or make new discoveries or detect new patterns by making that information freely available. And finally, he had a collaborator who'd been almost entirely ignored, a local vicar by the name of Henry Whitehead, a 25-year-old local man of the cloth, not at all a man of science, who was one of those connectors who just knew everyone in the neighborhood. He had no medical training, no scientific training, but he was just, the kind of local vicar who would hang out in the pubs late at night drinking beer with people in his flock. And he got involved with Snow, and it was Whitehead who ended up tracking down a lot of the people who had fled the neighborhood because he had this kind of on-the-ground neighbor connection to them. And it was Whitehead who ultimately found the patient zero, the index case, the little baby girl who actually started the outbreak in the first place, which also was crucial in convincing the authorities that Snow's theory was right. So 2 very different kinds of intellect, the kind of social intelligence of Whitehead and this amazing medical, cartographic, epidemiological intelligence of Snow, coming together to solve this in a collaborative way. And I realized that this was a great kind of emblem of how true innovation happens, breakthrough ideas that do truly change the world, is that these ideas happen in networks. They happen not as the lone genius who has, isolates him or herself and has this brilliant idea in a thunderbolt. But they come out of these kind of diverse, connected, grounded networks where diverse talents come together and solve a problem. And that's what I think we have the opportunity to do with these new platforms, is to build more of these kinds of networks. I want to talk about a couple of the patterns that I think, the strategies that I think are really most important in really tapping the innovative potential of these environments. And the first one is something we've seen in the case of snow, which is what I call the slow hunch. Eureka moments are overrated. We like to tell stories of innovation using the Eureka moment story where the apple falls from the tree and you've got a theory of gravity. There's something nice about telling the story that way. But when you go back and look at the history of innovation, you almost always find that great ideas have a long incubation period. They start with this hunch, this feeling that there's a problem that you could solve in a new way, but you can't quite explain why. And they sometimes stay in that state for years, even in some cases as long as a decade. And so part of the trick of an organization or an individual is to figure out a way to keep those hunches alive. Because it's so easy to forget to store them somewhere, to kind of upload them somewhere so that you can revisit them or that they can kind of commingle with other hunches in other people's minds. Because they are the true kind of seeds of truly breakthrough ideas. Great example of a hunch that changed the world, of a slow hunch that changed the world, is kind of embedded in this image here. This room can figure out what this is. It says, the handwriting says, "This machine is a server, do not power it down." And the giveaway there is that it says CERN in the upper left-hand corner. This little sticker was on the original World Wide Web server, back when the World Wide Web was running on one machine, which I like. You could literally trip over the power cord and the entire web would go offline. And Tim Berners-Lee, in coming up with the web, he worked on this project for kind of 6 or 7 years as a side project at CERN. He got there as a young programmer, was kind of overwhelmed by all the information that was flowing through the place, all the amazing projects, and he started tinkering with this thing on the side. Didn't tell his superiors about it for quite a long time, and it wasn't until 6 or 7 years later, after he'd gone through several iterations of it, that he finally had that awkward conversation with his boss where he had to go in and say, "I may have invented a global communications medium in my spare time. Can this be my day job, please?" And it was because, and it's crucial to the story, that Berners-Lee had in his own personal temperament and in his work environment, that he was able to keep that hunch alive for that long a period of time. Most of us get distracted, and we don't kind of follow those hunches, or we don't keep them going over 5 or 6 years. But he was able to do that, and the world changed because of this. But it's also crucial that he wasn't building it all from scratch, right? He had people like Vint Cerf who had built this underlying platform of the internet that he could build a kind of a layer on top of, and he was borrowing and kind of remixing other technologies like SGML, modifying it and turning it into HTML. So that hunch, as important as it was also kind of a network of other ideas and other platforms and other technologies. The idea wasn't a single thing, it was a network of ideas. So then the question becomes, if ideas are made out of kind of multiple hunches and existing technologies, what are the environments then that allow those hunches and ideas to kind of coalesce into something larger than themselves? And I call those environments liquid networks. They're environments where there's a certain kind of fluidity and exchange of ideas. Economists have a wonderful term for this. They call it information spillover. City neighborhoods have this property where you just put people together with a lot of density, and ideas just kind of jump from one mind to the other, and they jump across borders. And one of my favorite examples, again, kind of from history, of a liquid network at work, one of the great kind of idea-generating spaces of all time, was the 18th century coffee house. An extraordinary idea generator, really responsible for most of the great thinking of the Enlightenment. If you had to figure out where the Enlightenment really happened, more often than not, it happened in a coffee house. This is partially because everybody was drinking coffee for the first time. Before that, everybody was just drinking alcohol in Europe all day long, and they switched from kind of waking up and drinking beer for breakfast to drinking coffee. And so it's no accident there was a great flowering of intellectual activity that happened. But the other thing about the coffee house, I mean, Lloyd's of London was originally Lloyd's Coffee House, right? It was a place where the ship captains and the local merchants and the investment community would meet up and have kind of casual conversations over coffee. And out of that, the modern insurance business was born. Ben Franklin, when he lived in London for the many years that he lived there, he used to hold court at this place called the London Coffee House. And he had this group that would meet every 2 weeks, and they would have these wide-ranging conversations about electricity and the American political situation and other emerging sciences and Unitarian religion. And out of those sessions, this amazing stream of new ideas and collaborations came. I actually went back, when I was researching this, to London to look for, see if there was a plaque where this coffee house used to be, because, you know, in London there's like a plaque on every other building. And sadly, there's no record of it, but I swear to God, there is a Starbucks exactly where this coffee house used to be. So they're keeping the torch alive, even though they have no idea. What made the coffee house so generative is the fact that it was a multidisciplinary space. It was a place where people were talking, kind of, as we would say now, kind of across the borders of their expertise. They were kind of moving from silo to silo. They weren't just locked in one specialty. And it was that kind of exchange and diversity that made so many of those new ideas possible. And that's one of the things we really want to work with in these new platforms, is to figure out ways to connect people across disciplines. Because it's those kind of migrations from one field to another that often become the most transformative ideas. And this takes us, I think, to a very different position on the importance of diversity. It's not the political argument for diversity. It's not the multicultural argument for diversity. It's in a sense that by surrounding ourselves with people who are different from us, who have different experiences, and using tools to make those connections, we'll have better ideas. A few years ago, there was a Stanford business professor named Martin Roif, and he built these social network maps, not kind of Facebook or Twitter or Google Plus maps, but maps of literally kind of hand-drawn maps of people's kind of real-world friends. And he looked at two groups: unusually innovative people and people who were a little less innovative in their careers. And what he found was, if you analyze the kind of friend structure of the innovators, what they had that differentiated them was that they had a lot more connections to a much more diverse range of professions. That they might have worked in advertising, but they knew an architect and a plumber and a popular science writer and a poet and a government contract lawyer. And it was that diversity of experience when you're talking with your friend at the coffee house and you're having this conversation and they're working on something else totally different, but you get an idea and you borrow it and you port it over and it turns into something new, something transformative in your own space. So that diversity of exchange is so crucial to our collaborative environments. And this is an old story, right? It goes back to the very roots of technology. When Gutenberg was trying to invent the printing press, he had done all this extraordinary work with movable type and with inks. The inks were a very complicated technical problem. But he didn't have a pressing mechanism for a long time. And so it turned out to be, kind of grape harvesting season in Rhineland, Germany. So he went up into the hills to drink some wine because coffee hadn't come yet. And he's up there and he looks around and he sees this ancient technology of the screw press, which had been around for 2,000 years, used to press grapes. And he looks at it and he says, wait a second, this is what I need. And so he goes and he borrows this very old piece of technology from a completely different field and kind of modifies it, brings it down and ports it over and attaches his new state-of-the-art tech to it. And he takes a machine that was designed to press grapes and he turns it into a machine for printing Bibles. And that is so often the story of innovation. A machine, technology, a platform designed for one thing turns out to be good at something else in a new surprising context. And so when you take all these elements together and you open them up to lots of contributors and lots of people kind of adding and enhancing and expanding the system in new ways, you develop new platforms that will go in directions that their creators never dreamed of. That's a sign of a truly innovative environment. It's when kind of the users or other people on the network or people you've never met are taking your creation and doing amazing new things with it. And I think that, in fact, one of the most exciting things that's going on right now, one of the things that I find most kind of energizing, is that we have a great new opportunity for not just kind of market-driven, not just kind of private sector innovation using these new tools, but we also have a great opportunity for public sector innovation. That governments can think of themselves as platforms, to use a phrase from Tim O'Reilly, and that they can share data and allow ordinary citizens to kind of build new solutions or solve problems on top of these platforms in a way that would have been much, much harder to do before we had things like cloud computing. And I'll give you one great example of this. It's maybe my favorite story about public sector innovation that I've come across. And it involves the wonderful service 311, which is now in a lot of cities around the world. Probably one of the best implementations of it is in New York City. And 311 is a service that both allows you to kind of do kind of soft 911 calls where you can call in and say, hey, there's something going on. It's not an emergency, but the authorities should probably know about it. But you can also call in and say, hey, I'm in the park. I'm looking for kids' events. Is anything going on? Or is it a snow day? And they're live operators who will answer all your calls and give you the information you need. Or you can report problems. You can say, there's a pothole on my street, or the bar down the street is making too much noise. Now, all of that is great from the citizen's point of view. But the city uses that platform to get smarter as well. So it takes all this data, it analyzes it, it looks for patterns in the data, and figures out where the priorities are. What's the most kind of complained about pothole? What's the bar that's making the most noise that we need to talk to? And so what it's doing, in a sense, is saying, let's use the entire population of a city, anyone who can dial 3 numbers on a phone, to solve the problem of the kind of information overload problem of a great city. You know, what are the immediate needs of the citizens of this 8 million person city? So a few years ago, and I experienced this firsthand, so I can testify for it, the strange thing started to happen in New York, where every few months, people would be walking around a neighborhood in New York, normally on the west side, and they would be overwhelmed by the smell of maple syrup. And they'd be like in West Chelsea walking down the street, and suddenly they'd just be like pancakes. You know, they were just a really strong smell of maple syrup. And this was kind of post 9/11 New York, and so everybody's a little nervous, right? They're like, is this some kind of chemical attack? The whole neighborhood smells like maple syrup. What's that about? And so, you know, they were like, kind of, is this some kind of attack by, you know, the Aunt Jemima wing of Al Qaeda? And so they would call 311 and they would say, hey, you know, it smells like maple syrup in Chelsea. What's going on? And so the first time this happened, you know, the city sent some people out to test the air, and they found that it was fine. And so they instructed the 311 operators to, you know, just tell everyone not to panic. But it kept happening. And in fact, it kept happening so regularly that the city started referring to these things as maple syrup events, like capital M, capital S, capital E, which was like the worst episode of 24 you've ever seen in your life, the maple syrup event. And this went on for years. And then finally, someone inside 311 realized all these calls that are coming in, they're not just kind of complaints or people worried, they're clues. Right? We know where the calls were coming from. We know the days they came in. Let's take all that data and look at it and map it, just like Jon Snow did 150 years before in the streets of London. And they took the data and they analyzed the weather patterns for each day that an MSE had erupted. And when they aggregated all of it, it turned out that when you looked at it together, you would see this very clear vector that was pointing directly to New Jersey, maybe not a surprise. And it turned out, I love New Jersey. It turned out that right across the Hudson, there was a kind of a flavor taste additive plant that every so often would process fenugreek seeds, which are used in many cuisines around the world. But in an American supermarket, you're most likely to find them in the aisle in the supermarket where they sell cheap maple syrup knockoffs, maple syrup substitutes. And so that's where this smell was coming from. Now, what I love about this story is, yes, it turned out to not be a life or death thing. It wasn't like the cholera outbreak in London. But 311 was not designed as a platform, as a technology, to kind of solve the riddle of where strange breakfast smells were coming from, right? That was not part of the blueprint for the service. But because it was this open platform, because anyone could contribute to it, anyone who was kind of a resident of the city who could use 311 and dial these 3 numbers on the phone, because their observations and their needs and the things that they were seeing on the ground in the community were all kind of free to flow into the system, and because those patterns could be recognized and mapped and responded to, it turned out to be a system both for identifying this new potential threat and solving the roots of where it came from, all in one amazing fell swoop, precisely because it was this collaborative structure. And so sometimes the collaborations that make the difference are those kind of 8 people with diverse temperaments and diverse sensibilities sharing their hunches in a coffee house face to face. And sometimes, if you do them right, those breakthroughs and those innovations involve 8 million people sharing a new platform anonymously, but pointing out new problems and new solutions by contributing their small little pieces along the way. And I think that is the principle that should be driving us from here on out, right? That we want to build systems that allow that kind of diversity, that allow those voices to talk to each other across domains of experience. And we can then kind of, to paraphrase Louis Pasteur's great maxim, we can live in a world where chance favors the connected mind. Thank you very much. Thanks for that. Thank you.
So there were so many echoes in your remarks with what Vint had to say just earlier, both extolling the power of openness and generativity and unexpected third-party contributions to things. And both of you, for a moment, too, dwelling on security and security issues. Vint as an important takeaway. We should be really nervous about it and taking it in hand. And a lot of your examples are drawn from public health and the maple syrup 24 situation, which is minor security, but security nonetheless. So I guess I just wanted to ask, for our audience, principally of CIOs, they are dealing with security issues all the time, and I'll bet they'd get some odd looks if they proposed being extremely transparent about, all right, they tried to knock us down on Wednesday, but we came back, threw a few more servers on the rack, and another incident happened on Friday. I mean, this is stuff that's usually held very closely. Yeah. So I wanted to give you an opportunity maybe to more specifically, if you're inclined, to make the case as to why that particular kind of security might be amenable to the kind of public data eureka path that we saw with the cholera stuff, and whether you think such aggregation is best done government style, 311, or is it kind of an industry consortium sort of thing that would bring people together for this?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jonathan. So a couple of things I would say. The first is, I think one of the things we want to get right is the balance between, in a sense, protection and connection, right? That we have this default setting, I think, particularly in this society, that if we have kind of valuable ideas, we want to hide them and isolate them and put boxes around them, whether it's in a kind of closed secret lab somewhere, whether it's intellectual property wrappers, whatever it is we do, or whether it's strong encryption. And there is a place for that. We want to have, we want our ideas to be valuable, and there's a certain amount of scarcity that's built into that. But we also have to remember that if you look at the kind of broad scope of the history of innovation, that every time we do that, we pay a kind of innovation tax, right? Because that idea is not free to be modified and improved upon and tweaked by our customers, our competitors in some cases, or other people in the kind of broader organization. And so you have to figure out kind of the right balance there. If you're talking about people actually kind of hacking into your systems to steal closed data or actual currency, that's something where you want to have strong protection. But if you're talking about experimenting with kind of models and prototypes of new products and things like that, increasing the amount of openness you have and allowing people to kind of give you that kind of open collaborative feedback and to tinker with your designs, there's an incredible opportunity for kind of connective sharing there that I think would be a shame to miss.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Great to see you.
Thanks a lot, everyone.